Okay, and away you go.
Okay, hi everyone.
Hello.
Yes, it's very weird doing this. I feel like a ghost lecturer rather than doing it by proxy. But so before we start, just a bit about myself. So I've been researching the popular music industries for the last 20 years. That's how I kind of got into academia. Even though I did a media studies degree to begin with, and I teach within the media department at Monash. My primary research interest has been popular music studies, and particularly popular music industry studies. And that flows from a personal interest. Now, from my sins, I was a rock drummer through the 80s in Sydney. So I played with different bands in Sydney. So my primary interest in the policy area comes from being a musician myself, in terms of what it means to play in pubs and clubs, what it means to get a recording contract, what it means for musicians to negotiate different areas of the industry, but also different areas of government. So what I want to do tonight is just go through some policy terrain which looks at popular music. So admittedly, popular music is a very small field in terms of larger arts and cultural budgets. It's certainly not uppermost in the minds of politicians or arts administrators. But it's fair to say in the last 10 years it has become more prevalent in arts policies, particularly if you look at New South Wales or Queensland or Victoria in the Australian context. And it's certainly become more prevalent in national arts policies that Australia has produced.
Wouldn't you say that music was a big winner in Creative Australia?
Yeah. I mean, they certainly devoted more funding and more money around using popular music, particularly things for in terms of export, and particularly linking popular music to national identity. Yeah. So to begin with, if I can start at the broad level, so if we go to the next slide after the cover slide, if you look at the policy frameworks, and if you can see there, I've done a kind of diagram of the interplay here. So this is at a very broad level, and I think you can apply this to any national context. So firstly, you've got policies. So what do we mean by policy? Well, simply, intentions, goals that a particular government might want to do. So we're all familiar with different policy. And in the Sydney context, for example, we had a policy, if you think of a specific policy problem, like the so-called coward's punch, so people dying from being king hit in and around venues late at night in Sydney. So the policy goal for the state government was, how do we stop late night violence? And the policy outcome, of course, was a new limit to 3 a.m. Closing for most pubs and clubs in the Sydney's TBD. So we need to think about policy initially as what are the frames of action, what are the goals, what are the intentions of a particular government, and how do they see those intentions through to a specific policy that has particular outcomes. So if we attach culture to that notion of policy, what are the specific goals attached to economic, social structures and traditions? So we need to match policy to particular cultural traditions. So how is culture viewed broadly in Australia, for example? How is it viewed at a state level, at a local government level? Is culture seen as a good thing by and large? What are the shadow or dark sides of culture? And then if we link that to audiences, the notion of, where audiences sit between industries and governments. So today I'd like you to think about this lecture in terms of yourselves as music fans. So if you're interested in music, how does policy interact with your own interests and activities as a fan? And that could mean how you interact with regulation policy when you go to a venue, or if you go to a festival, when you buy a CD, when you download an MP3. So there's a whole range of things you can start thinking about there, about yourselves as a music consumer. And indeed, how being a music consumer is different from being a music fan. So far we've looked at, so you've got policy interactions with culture, and then we had the further complexity of the audience. And we had a further complexity in terms of industries. So if you think about the music industry, there's 5 broad categories. So we've got the recording industries, so your Universal Music, Sony, BMG, etc. Then you've got the live music industry, so venues, promotion, festivals, live music circuits of all different kinds. Then you've got music media, so music journalism, those kinds of things. And you've also got music education. And we could also throw in there, I suppose, things like music retail. The selling of music instruments is a massive retail sector all on its own. So we start to see the complexity here of how do industries intersect with audiences in terms of consumption and production. How do both industries and audiences interact with governments? And governments have to make decisions about which industries to assist, which industries they think aren't worth monetary assistance, which industries they might see as a social or cultural problem. And that gets us to regulation. So what I've said there, the legal instruments framing industry and citizen behaviour. So regulation is different from policy in that we're talking about specific instruments which frame or are intended to frame our behaviour. So that could be a specific policing regulation, for example, in a music venue. We can think, again, if you think about the late trading hours curfew in Sydney at the moment, that's a specific legal regulatory instrument that's designed to assist in a larger policy goal, if that makes sense. So we need to think about these interactions between regulation, industries, audiences, and if you like, sitting on top of all that are wider government views about culture. And to make it even more complex, we need to think about high versus low culture. So high culture here in terms of music, we're thinking about the National Opera Company. We're thinking about symphony orchestras. So we're talking about classical and art music. So we need to think there's always a binary there. There's always a contradiction policy between how art music and classical music is funded and supported, and the different ways in which popular music, the so-called low musics or popular music, so country, pop, rock, rap, hip-hop, etc., are funded and viewed by governments. That's changing, but there's been a broad historical trend there. If you think about the Australia Council, for instance, the Australia Council we'll come to the Australia Council, but it's the primary funding body for all cultural activity in Australia. And 60% of the Australia Council's funding every year is devoted simply to opera and classical music, 60% of its budget. Now, that simple statistic should tell you what the kind of underlying discourse is about where governments view, particularly where the federal government views the importance of which types of culture, and in particular which types of music they deem worthy of support. So I find that quite an astonishing statistic. The 60% of the national cultural funding body activity goes to two forms of art music. We'll come back to that.
Is that their national music? Sorry, is it the music budget you're talking about, the music funding, or?
I'm saying this. The Australia Council funds all kinds of cultural activity, and what I'm saying that 60% of that budget, which includes everything from dance to Indigenous ballet to, I'm saying 60% of the budget just goes to classical and opera music.
Okay, so this is not. So this is the entire Australia Council budget. You're not just talking about the monies that are allocated to music.
No, that's right. I'm not saying it's 60% of the music budget. I'm saying it's 60% of the entire budget.
That is pretty astonishing.
It is. So, anyway,
Are you still on slide 2?
Yes, I'm just about to go to slide 3. So before I go on, are there any questions about that broad framework I've put up?
No.
No?
So that statistic is actually in their annual reports. Like
That's a complex question because they don't like to put it as broadly as that in their reports. They argue that it's not that simple. There's a whole other lecture there about why they. But certainly, if you go into their annual report, you'll see the pie graphs, which kind of more or less show that to be the case.
So you work it out from the annual reports, but they don't make it explicit.
No, they make it very hard for you to work out to do the total sum of all the funding.
Right. Okay.
So, okay, if we go to slide 3.
Sure. Yep.
So, my brief working definition of cultural policy tonight comes from David Hesmondolch's book, The Culture Industries, which I can highly recommend, particularly for this subject. So, Dave simply says, cultural policy in the broadest terms, especially in the Anglophone world, so this definition is used broadly within Canada, Australia, England, New Zealand, and simply refers to the subsidy, regulation and management of the arts. So if you think about that policy framework I just talked about, we need to think about broadly where popular music and popular culture are subsidised by the state, and the arguments for subsidising by the state, why put hard cash in a particular music area, and by implication, not putting it into other areas. How is popular music regulated? And what Dave calls the broad management of the arts. So we can lump regulation and management together in that sense. So I think there are other more complex definitions, but I think that's a good broad definition to be going on with. So cultural policy simply encompasses where activities are subsidised, where they're regulated, and where they're managed. And there's been a shift, of course. Governments don't like to talk about the arts anymore, they like to talk about culture. And that's another broad shift where you've got a broader definition of activity. So the culture could also encompass things like heritage, policies, and culture implies that things like popular music are included now, rather than simply the arts, which are more high culture activities. So we take that broad definition of Hesmondolch's. What do we simply mean? What are the implications for popular music and governments? Well, as I said, this throws up questions of which types of music. Which types of music do you include for subsidy, for regulation and management? Which types of music do you say we should support as a matter of principle? And which should we not? Again, the classic example, of course, the Australia Council funding, which says, almost by default, the federal government should heavily invest in art music, in symphony orchestras. There's a symphony orchestra in each state, and we should also support things like the National Ballet, National Opera. So which types of activity are not supported by default? So, for example, up until recently, things like hip-hop music were not supported, although they're increasingly coming under kind of youth leisure and youth policies in other ways. Which goals should state and federal governments pursue? And this is an interesting question too on its own. There's broad industry policy arguments that governments should throw their support and funding behind particular music industries because they'll get a return on their investment. That is, it's good for the economic bottom line to support the pop music industries, for instance, because they'll help basically GDP of another nation or a particular city? Or do you pursue popular music policies that support particular audience outcomes? So, for example, we had the introduction of parallel importing in Australia in the mid-90s, which broadly meant that people could parallel import a CD, even though they didn't own the copyright to that CD in the host country. And that was designed to actually bring prices down for CDs for consumers. So we need to think about the ways in which there are specific industry policies and perhaps then specific consumer policies. Who gets to win out at the cabinet table? Is it the audience member or fan or consumer, or is it a particular industry? And then finally, we need to think about who is being managed, if you like. We need to think about the music producer or the music industry worker or the music fan in terms of how they're managed by the state. And that could be for good and for bad. So you might feel good if you get a grant if you get a $10,000 grant from the state government to make your first recording. So that's fantastic. That's a nice type of management. Then we need to think about the shadow forms of management. For example, refusing a visa to a hip hop artist because they've got a criminal record in another country, or tight management or regulation of a music festival because it's got a bad reputation. Drug searches at festivals. So we can think about all the different ways in which there is kind of shadow regulation or the dark side of management in terms of policy. So my plea here is to say policy simply isn't about funding, but it's also about regulation, both good and bad. And of course, people make arguments about which states these are examples of both good and bad funding. So in terms of what I've just talked about, if we go to slide 4. So given there's only 3 of you, we can probably just discuss this.
Yes, there's 4. You just
Oh,
can't.
sorry.
It's Jamie there too.
Sorry. I need a panorama TV screen.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to just discuss for a little while the ways in which you see policy or regulation playing out in terms of popular music. So if we just start thinking about, in terms of relationships between governments, music audiences and producers, if you can just throw at me some examples that you can think off the top of your head about how policy or regulation plays a part in any kind of music activity.
I think for me, first thing that comes to mind is liquor licenses.
Yep.
And control of it, because venues and by default music as well are all linked to in many ways being kind of subsidised by the profit made from selling of alcohol, and then regulations that come with that can have a direct impact on venues and musicians as well.
Yeah, okay, so that liquor licensing is an excellent example. Can you speak to why liquor licensing is important?
Because it can impact on audiences as well. So age of your audiences, and if a venue, for instance, loses its liquor license, then that's one less venue for musicians, performers to operate in, as well as a struggle on the venue if it's more of a say arts / live music or music venue. So you're more kind of grassroots operation.
Are you leaning towards the violence article that we read about high-risk venues and the license changes?
Yeah. I mean that links into it.
Yep.
Jamie actually works for City of Sydney, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Not in that area, but yeah. And I'm involved with a not-for-profit art space that's mainly kind of live music. So
okay. Yep.
Yeah, big impact.
Super high now.
Yeah.
One I can think of is with public funded radio, so community radio and things like Triple J, and I'm not sure what Triple J, but I know that our community radio station here, FBI, they have to have 50% of their music has to be homegrown. And I'm sure there's some similar regulations within other community radio stations and maybe even Triple J. So that's one I can think of.
Is that a broadcasting regulation? It's not
Yeah.
a station's policy.
Oh, I'm not sure on that one actually. No. But
Yeah,
I imagine. Yeah, sorry, you go.
I know, I was going to say, you did right. There's a code of practice for both commercial and public broadcasters.
Yeah.
So within the ABC Act of Parliament, yes, you did right. So someone like Triple J has to play, I think it's 50%, similar with the community ones. But there's a commercial code of practice as well, which they must play 25% Australian music between 6 a.m. and midnight.
Oh, okay.
And 25% of that 25% must be less than 12 months old.
Oh, right.
So you did right. So that
Yeah.
there's currently about 20 countries around the world which have national local music quotas for their broadcasters, and that's a very hot topic. So you did right. That's a very hot topic because, understandably, the commercial broadcasters think they're being forced to play material which gives them, puts them at a distinct disadvantage. And in cases like jazz radio stations, they argue that there's simply not enough Australian material to meet the quotas.
Right.
I think the quota's less. I think the jazz quota's about 10%.
Right.
Well, the flip
You're
side
right.
of that is why is it that commercial broadcasters get off lightly as far as local content is concerned?
Yeah, well, they see it as, well, Australian music should stand on its own 2 feet, and if it's not popular, then we shouldn't have to play it. But it's a very hot topic.
Yeah.
And that's where national identity issues come into play, of course. In that the industry argues very loudly, very heatedly, that if the local radio broadcasters do not play Australian music, there's a good chance we'll just be simply overwhelmed with international content. And we are a net importer. As a country, we're a net importer of popular music content. We import a heck of a lot more than we export. And that's same goes for TV. There's a 55% Australian local content stand on for commercial TV stations as well. And they hate that as well. And they've always tried to take it off the table. Yep, so that's a very good example. Any others?
I've got another one.
Go on.
It ties in with what Jamie said with the and what you mentioned before, the new lockout laws in Sydney.
Yep.
Obviously, they're meant to stop violence and whatnot, but they've also stopped, the club scene in the Cross, and obviously a lot of music venues like popular house venues have to move out of the CBD and move to inner west to get out of that. So I guess that's one way. That's another way that it affected
Yep.
musical activity. Yeah.
Yep. And that's a really good example of a kind of indirect policy
Mm.
which indirectly affects a music venue. So it wasn't directly aimed at the music venue, but it ends up affecting them anyway.
Mm.
And you're right, and a lot of clubs have said, well, we used to have a 6 a.m. trading licence, and now our profits are being halved. We're struggling to compete. And there's been cases where people, get in cars and, go across to suburbs and they can go all night. So the locational advantages of that policy too are very interesting.
Yeah.
Yep. Any others?
Do things like Rage and like MTV video clips count in the music industry, or are they counted as broadcasting regulations? Because sometimes, I think there's a lot of imported music stuff, especially in the media. We got Miley Cyrus coming to Australia as soon as she converted, and there wasn't even, I don't know, there's more interesting things out there to find out about, but it was all over the media. I was like, I don't get it. I'm sure if that's entirely relevant, but it's interesting that we're so, that we do import so much through America, but not so much through maybe New Zealand or something. I'm sure there's stuff happening.
Yep. I think Rage holds a record now. It's the longest continuously broadcast music program in the world. I think it's set the new world record for being on air. But you raise a good point about promotion and visibility, in that people have complained that we no longer have. I suppose there's programs like the Loop, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, we had 2 or 3 really strong national music TV programs, which did a really good job of promoting Australian content. And it's becoming scarcer and scarcer on Australian TV screens to actually see Australian content promoted nationally. So I think, you raise a good point there about how do Australian acts. There's a age-old wisdom in the industry now. They say if you don't get Triple J play, forget about doing a national tour. Unless you're on high rotation on Triple J, you don't stand a good chance of actually getting decent audiences to do a national tour. So I think you raise a good point about the interlinks here between the linkages between media policy and music policy and and opportunities constraints for musicians. So I think that's a very viable one to consider.
Something else that was interesting, when I went to the States, when we told people that we were Australian, what we heard was the theme from Down Under, like Crocodile Dundee 80s tunes, and they didn't have, they don't import Australian music, I guess. There was no more recent song to represent us, so I come from the land down under and I love Vegemite. It's still our global image, I guess, which is weird.
Yeah, and until recently, music export programs used to throw, well, they still do, they throw Aussie Barbies when they go to music export festivals. So there's that, it's based on that cliche of, we have Barbies and we wear cool hats. And so you're right, I think there's an argument there about how out of date.
Identity. Yeah.
But it hasn't been updated through the success of people like Gautier and the like.
Well, maybe people are listening to Australian music, but they don't know it's Australian.
Yeah, and there's a comparable debate in the film industry about whether we should make very peculiar, quirky Australian films that are distinctively Australian, or whether you forget about that and go for the blockbuster market and make this kind of internationalised genre where it doesn't really matter whether it looks quirkily Australian or not. I think there's a similar debate in the music industry. Okay.
I remember that a friend of mine was working for DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs, and he was helping out in LA with a kind of Australian showcase where they had brought over a couple of emerging Aussie bands to perform kind of, basically as a like trade show or export, expose to promote the kind of Australian music scene. So that's, I guess, an example of government directly, but maybe softly, promoting Aussie music.
Yep. Yeah, and there's always recommendations that Australia should show its cultural colours, if you like, and they should have more Australian bands at Australian overseas fairs, at diplomatic events. That we should actually employ more Australian musicians to go overseas and do those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. It's becoming a big business now, and lots of countries do much better at that than us. I'm thinking, Britain, Norway, Sweden, those kinds of countries throw a lot more money into kind of music as diplomacy and also music as cultural export. But I'll come back to that. Okay, if we can go on to the next slide.
Yep.
So number 5. So what I was getting at previously, this is just to kind of reinforce the intimate link between values and policies. So I've got a good quote there from Roy Schuker, who is a policy researcher in New Zealand. And so Roy says, state cultural policies are indicative of the various views he held about the very concept of culture itself. So, if you're a hip-hop artist and you can see that you can go for a $10,000 grant to make your first recording, as opposed to seeing the National Opera Company get something like, $30 billion in funding every year. That brings out Roy's basic point that we need to follow the cultural policy to get the idea about the concept of culture that flows through that policy. So that's partly, if we follow the funding trail, that partly gives us a world view, if you like, of a state or a federal government, or even a local council. If we follow the funding trail, we can see that they're stamping their own views on which types of culture and which concepts of culture they're following as a matter of a broad discourse. So we need to look at policies tied to values. So what's the mix and extent for high culture, and what's the mix and extent of support for low, if you like, popular culture? And jazz, for example, is a very interesting concept here because it's stuck conceptually, I think, between high and low musics. It's still seen as a kind of special high music, particularly because it relies so much on ad-libbing and being highly innovative in and of the moment and improvisation. So it's caught between the two stools, if you like, of being popular and populist and also being in art music. I think it's suffered consequently for that in terms of state support. But it throws up for me a bigger question. One of the things we should be discussing tonight is, where and when should governments intervene? So if we think about all policy as a battle for scarce resources, where should governments intervene to assist popular music? And I'd add two caveats there. So where should governments intervene in the name of the free market? Or where should they intervene in the name of the national interest? So I think pretty broadly up until the early 80s, apart from high culture, as I said, governments pretty much didn't see any significance in intervening in popular culture. Popular culture was left to the free market. So popular music was part of that. That it's a commercial set of industries. It should be left to get on with the selling and buying of records and live concerts, and government should stay out of the way because it's pretty much a free market set of industries. Now that discourse has changed gradually through the 80s and 90s, where discourses of the nation kind of reared their head. So government seemed to intervene more and more in popular music in support in terms of the nation, in terms of discourses of national identity. And it's not just the case in Australia, it's also the case in other countries like New Zealand, which has now a complex set of national policies around popular music. If you look at Britain, and particularly Canada's a really good example. I like citing Canada because it's a similar sized country to us. It's got similar problems in that it's got the US on its doorstep. It has similar problems in terms of how to export its own culture against such a giant such as the US on its doorstep. And it's come up with a really set of innovative policies around promoting local culture, local music. And for example, they have similar local quotas around radio broadcasting, but also very similar policies around promotion of local recordings and touring and whatnot. So there's always a battle here, I think, between not just the concept of culture, which we can see in particular policies, but also this battle between the nation and the free market. And of course, some people in the industry hate the idea of government intervention. They absolutely hate the idea that governments intervene. Some very big heavyweights in the industry, heads of recording labels, and the larger companies usually don't want governments to intervene. They just see it as interference, not support. And if you think about the complex world of copyright policy, for example, which we can come back to. Okay, so we go to the next slide. I'd just like to go through some examples of what we're talking about here. Some more examples in terms of policy at the national level. So if we take the Australian federal government as an example, So you've already got arts funding, as I said, through the Australia Council. And as we've already discussed, the bulk of the funding is around what I call flagship companies, such as Opera Australia. There's a whole range, though, now of music grants, at the smaller end, much smaller scale. You can find them on the Australian Council website, which is a very good website, and it's got lots of really good research, by the way, on the average yearly wage of a musician in Australia, where they play. They've got lots of really good stats now on the typical life of an Australian musician. But there are a smaller series of grants through recording, and particularly touring grants. So Australia, of course, is a large country relatively to the rest of the world, and there are grants. You can make a case, particularly if you're an original band, to assist you in doing your first tour, or maybe your second and third tour of Australia. There's a series of recording grants. There's a series of mentorship programs where you can apply for money to get a hotshot producer to do your next album. And some of those are outlined if you look at the Creative Australia document, which was put together by the Labor government in 2013. Secondly, there's a range of trade and export schemes. The biggest one is called Sounds Australia. And Sounds Australia has been going for, I think, 4 or 5 years. They recently boosted its funding to $3 million a year. And if you're a hot band or musician and you think you can make a case to break internationally, you can apply for grant programs for Sounds Australia to help you get overseas. And that extends to assisting grants for managers, grants for individual bands, and Sounds Australia will hook you up and assist you at particular music festivals. So key festivals such as South by Southwest, for example, a band will be taken over by Sounds Australia. They'll be hooked up for meetings with international recording companies. They'll be hooked up with other international managers. Sounds Australia will help them map out an international touring program. And it's really about, showcasing, saying, here's a hot new band from Australia. You should give them a go, and helping to map out particular territories and markets they can explore. And that, just from my study of it, it seems to be doing quite well. It's assisted in breaking a lot of bands overseas. And the latest person they're pushing through the Sounds Australia program is Courtney Barnett. So if you think of those kind of musicians who did a really good first or second album, who are seen as having some international appeal, Sounds Australia will step in and assist them break internationally. So the other complication with trade and export, of course, is international trade agreements. So Australia recently signed a free trade agreement with China. It's had a free trade agreement with the US since 2004. And the big hot topic of debate at the moment is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So Australia's been in discussion, I think, with 15 other countries, where the US is pushing what they're calling a Trans-Pacific Partnership, where we all get on the same page in terms of copyright, IP laws, and copyright's the big deal within that partnership in terms of standardising copyright laws, where every country has the same identical copyright regulations and laws. So while we can see national policies emerging, there is also a parallel emergence, I think, of global policies, whether it's through free trade agreements or things like the World International, such as global agreements around copyright and IP, for example. We also need to consider education at the national level. There's been a push for music to be given more time within national primary school and high school curriculum. And there's been a big argument at the moment that the music industry has been arguing that people should be properly trained to teach music at primary school level. So up until now, you didn't have to be trained or play an instrument to teach music at primary school. There's been a push that you should have properly trained teachers dedicating at least half an hour a week to the curriculum to do music. So those things are always hot topics within state and federal education methods. More broadly, we can also think about border control and immigration. As I said, there's been particular musicians being denied visas in the past because they're deemed to be a bad character. Musician unions in the past have been really fierce in blocking certain musics, and they've also been fierce in trying to protect local musicians. For example, the British Musicians Union in the 50s blocked all American musicians from coming to Britain. And that was done in the name of protecting, local musicians and incomes. There's been debates in the past about, for example, whether it should be made law to ensure that Australian musicians should be a support act for every visiting international band. So for example, if anyone comes out to Australia, it's argued they should always have a local support act. That hasn't got up as policy yet. It has been talked about in the past. And finally, we should think about broader communication and media policy, which we discussed. That would extend to the national broadband rollout. We can think more laterally there about the effects on music in terms of, direct downloading into everyone's home, having a broadband pipe into everyone's home, the effects on that in terms of media and music content and copyright. We've already talked about local content quotas. So you can see here that music policy simply doesn't sit within a Ministry of Culture or a Minister of Arts for arts. You can see how music can flow across different portfolios at different times, depending on the government. So before we go on, any questions about those particular areas? No? Okay, if you go to the next slide. So at the state level, there is some duplication. We've already talked about licensing. Licensing in music venues related to law and order, trading hours, policing, etc. We've already talked about states have their own export programs in some cases. But the key things I want to talk about in terms of at the state level are things like heritage. So, for example, if you think about the interplay of licensing and heritage in Victoria, the Esplanade Hotel, the SP Hotel is located on the beach at St Kilda. It's where they film Rock Whiz. And I've actually gone and watched them film Rock Whiz at the SP in their larger room there. But the SP is the first venue which was granted cultural heritage status in Australia, simply because of its live music traditions and heritage. It had been a ballroom since the 1920s. It was threatened with demolition when a developer wanted to actually build a massive hotel behind it. And then the developer also wanted to buy the SP to actually increase the foot space of his development to include the hotel. So the SP is the only case I know in Australia where the local council, in concert with the state government, stepped in and granted it heritage status, in effect, to stop that development. So at the state level, we look at those kind of dirty politics, if you like, of those kinds of things around venues, venue behaviour. But it should be said that the states are the largest arts funders in the country. So collectively, the arts budgets for all the states outnumber the federal grants grants on a yearly basis. And of course, some states have their own funding, grants schemes related to recording, touring, And in some cases, they'll fund the improvement for venues to improve themselves, whether it's, to get a better PA, to soundproof. So I remember South Australia for a while had a grant for venue owners to buy a new PA or to soundproof their venues. And this is the weird thing about Australia, we're one of the few countries in the world with 3 levels of government, which most people outside of Australia think is really, really weird. So you do get some duplication. The other big thing I'd say at the state level is building and planning laws. So, for example, if you want to have a music venue on the first floor of a building, that is a building code nightmare compared to having it on the ground floor, for instance, in terms of fire laws, entrance, exits. And we can also think about larger city movements. Different cities come up different times to have cultural precincts or arts precincts in their cities, and music's usually part of those blueprints. And the biggest thing here I can say is to look at the Fortitude Valley experiment. I call it an experiment because it's the only place I know in Australia where they privileged live music at the expense, they privileged any music activity at the expense of any other activity. So Fortitude Valley is now explicitly coded within local and state government laws as a music precinct, and residents are explicitly told if you move to Fortitude Valley, you have to expect that the primary activity in the valley is music, whether it's a venue or a recording studio or a rehearsal studio. So planning, policing and licensing have all been changed to Fortitude Valley to emphasise music. Now that to me is a world first in terms of changing the building codes, the planning codes, to emphasise that is a music precinct within Brisbane. And if you go online on the web, there's different stuff in the extent to which how they made that happen. Okay, if we go to the next slide. And finally, as you can see there, at the local level, there's again a lot of duplication. Local councils are involved in urban planning, things like the building code, policing. They're of course involved in liquor licensing and policing in concert with state governments. And the local council is the first port of call, of course, for a noise complaint about a venue, or if a venue wants to expand its territory or wants to change its trading hours. But local council will also have their own kind of smaller schemes and grants at different levels. And of course, I often articulate music policies and programs to youth programs. And the clearest thing I can see there is, you get, for example, a council will have a program for youth at risk, where they'll get them to come in and do their own hip-hop songs, write their own songs, record them as part of kind of youth access programs and youth kind of leisure programs. So music's often employed by local councils to help disadvantaged or at-risk youth. Okay, so that's the boring national, state and local level overview. So any questions about any of that? No? Okay, so before we take a break, I'll just do one more slide. So if we have a look at the next slide, I've just given a list there of other interesting policy methods. So we have to think, so governments don't exist on their own, of course. They're always in negotiations with a whole range of other groups. So if you're a Minister for Arts, you're not only dealing with the ballet, the opera, dance, just even within music, even just within popular music, you're dealing with a whole range of other stakeholders. So this can be activist groups. So there's 2 groups in Victoria, for example. One's called Fair Go for Live Music, and that's made up of interested people who are lawyers, musicians, venue owners, academics, who kind of get together once every couple of months and discuss policy matters. There's a group called SLAM, which is called Save Live Australian Music, which is founded by two people who run a recording studio in Melbourne. That's been particularly effective at negotiating with governments around policy. You've got the trade unions, of course, so things like the Musicians Union of Australia, and the Musicians Union has different state branches of the union. They're always in discussions with government, and they help regulate things like musicians' pay, although I would argue they're pretty useless. But they still have an interest. They're still pretty good at negotiating things like symphony orchestra pay, ABC musicians' pay. So they're very good at those formal levels of negotiations. But as you can imagine, when it comes to if a 21-year-old musician gets ripped off at their local pub, I would argue the musician union aren't that effective. They're more interested at the more formal level of negotiations. We also have a range of state advisory bodies. In New South Wales, you've got Music New South Wales. Down here, we've got Music Victoria. In Brisbane, you've got Q Music. And in West Australia, you've got WAM. So these are all advisory bodies funded by the state governments to provide them with advice about the music industry. And they're usually headed by ex-musicians. And then, of course, we've got a whole range of industry bodies. So we've got things like APRA. APRA is the key copyright collection society in Australia. So if your CD is sold and the royalty flows through, it flows through to APRA. And they disperse the royalty then onto the musician and the recording company. We've also got ARIA, which is Australian Recording Industry Association. And you've got other smaller copyright bodies like the PVCA and AMCOS. Now, given that APRA has a massive budget, and they're the key collection society for royalties, they hold enormous policy sway when it comes to governments, and they're very influential. And then, of course, you've got universities, so music policy academics like myself. You've got the occasional think tank, cultural policy think tank. And, of course, you've got other musicians. Famous musicians can be very good stakeholders and activists on their own. And, of course, you've got fans who might make their voice heard on particular policy issues when it arises. So hopefully you're getting a picture here of the complexity of the policy area. It's not simply a matter of making a policy and then seeing how it goes. But particularly if you're a government minister, you have to please a whole range of different stakeholders. You all of course, have competing interests. So a fan might not have the same interests as the musician. The musician might actually hate the way that APRA formulates copyright policy or has a view of copyright policy. Or a venue owner might not necessarily agree with the musicians on pay or on how his or her venue is policed or regulated. So it's a very complex field which is replicated across different cultural areas. Okay, so before we have a break, any questions?
Isn't there a Music Council of Australia?
Oh, yes, you're right. That's yes.
Where does that sit?
Again, it has been influential in advising governments. It meets annually, and it's made up basically of either musicians or ex-policy makers at state and federal level. But yes, you're right. It is quite an influential body.
So it's an industry body.
Yeah, and it usually makes submissions whenever there's a particular policy change in the wind. It'll make a detailed submission, and it's mostly been concerned with things like media policy and protecting local content, quotas and the like.
You mentioned earlier that the bigger companies on a national level, places like Sony and Universal, have some hesitations, could possibly have some hesitations towards government intervention. I was just wondering, if you could outline some of those, or what were you thinking about when you said that?
Yeah, I think, well, they're hypocritical, those companies, because they always go cap in hand to the government and say, you need to make strong copyright laws to protect our investments. So the recording companies have been fantastically successful in getting governments to extend copyright terms. So first it was 50 years after the death of the author, then it becomes 70 years, and in some cases, in some countries now, it's 90 years after the death of the author. So the record companies have been hypocritical in saying, we need state intervention to protect our recording investments. But in most other cases, they like a hands-off approach. So the best examples I can give you is back in the mid-90s, there were concerns about swearing on records or inappropriate content in some songs. And the Howard government actually wanted to start putting sticker warnings on CDs. So that, that classic sticker which says, warning, this contains inappropriate content or swearing or whatever. So, of course, the industry hated that idea, absolutely hated it. And they kept saying to the government, you don't need to do this, we're a free market, it should be about free speech. You're going to affect our sales. Why? And it's going to cost us more to stick a thing anyway. And the government basically simply turned around and said, well, if you don't implement your own code of conduct around a set of graduated warnings, then we'll do it for you. So that in the end, the industry came up with its own sticker code for different content and actually implemented it because they'd rather do it than get the government to do it, which they thought the government would be more draconian.
Yep.
So there's been instances like that where the industry's had to actually say, we're rock and roll, man, you should leave us alone, we should be able to say what we want, we should be able to swear on our records if we want. But then the government stepped in and said, well, we're the elephant in the room, and if you don't do it, we'll do it for you. So they can be very hypocritical. The industry likes the government to step in where it suits their own interests.
Yeah.
It also seems that states have taken very different directions, policy directions. So the Fortitude Valley example is an interesting one in kind of, explicitly setting up this music precinct. And if you think about New South Wales then, I mean, they would be very happy to get rid of a music venue or get rid of a nightclub if there's been a drug death associated with it, if there's been a lot of complaints from neighbours that they would happily see a pub go under, and hence, the demise of the live music scene in Sydney. And then you see the Victorian example, which is very different. They've actually, while they haven't set up a music precinct like Fortitude Valley, they've encouraged smaller, I suppose quieter, live music venues.
Yeah, I mean, look, between 2003 and 2009, I worked closely with the New South Wales state government and eventually we got up a live music liquor licence. And the implication of getting a live music liquor licence as opposed to your standard general on-premises licence was to say that a live music venue has social benefits to a community rather than just economic benefits. So we saw that as a big win with the state government where we said, you've got to put into that there are social benefits to a venue, not just commercial benefits. So that is, changing the discourse from seeing a venue as being antisocial. Yes, depends on the publican. You can have really rat-bag venues and rat-bag publicans, but you also need to consider the ways in which music actually benefits communities and not just being seen as only social. Now that's probably started to unravel a bit because the hard politics of politics, rears its head and just smashes that kind of ideal. But that's why we pushed so hard to get a live music liquor licence, which said music is a normal part of a pub's operations. It shouldn't have to jump through any particular special hoops to allow music to happen in terms of noise laws, fire laws, and other regulations. So yes, that's still on the books, but I suppose you probably need a new study to examine how that's been implemented in practice and whether it's unravelled. If that makes sense.
Yeah, questions?
Can I ask, do you think that because of the whole, context and complexity around regulations and buildings and planning, that is why music sits aside as its own policy area rather than sitting under just a general arts and culture policy? Is it because of the kind of, the uniqueness and the various more tricky areas that are involved with music?
Yeah, and I think, yes. So sorry, what do you get?
I guess the kind of question is why doesn't music just sit under arts and cultural policy, whereas it does seem that it's its own policy area.
It is, but I mean, it always sits under a Minister of Arts at the state level, and always sits under a Minister of Arts at the federal level. So in Britain, they've got what they call a Minister of Culture for the nation. We've always stuck to the Minister for the Arts, which is the more traditional, title. But what I was simply saying before was, music is just one kind of speck, if you like, on the whole arts policy area, because it doesn't carry as much weight, for example, as film, because film's more important economically to the country than popular music. But is actually more economically important than, say, classical music. So you've got all these different tensions and hypocrisies there, if you like.
Do you think it's the most complex?
Between weight and scale.
Could you say it's the most complex area in terms of?
I know what I've described tonight. I think you could replicate it across any particular cultural area. You could bring someone else in for 2 hours and explain the similar complexities around, say, classical music policy, or the policy around ballet or dance, or even sports funding, for example. I think you see similar trends and similar hypocrisies and similar tensions. And every field, you could take each of these as a field, if you like, and see where stakeholders just keep butting heads up against each other.
Why do you think music was such a winner then in Creative Australia? Why was it sort of? It does seem to be kind of quite explicitly kind of targeted as a policy area.
I think it didn't hurt in the sense of having Peter Garrett as the Minister for Arts.
Yeah.
So having an actual musician for the first time be the National Arts Minister certainly helped. And he obviously had a friendly ear for any kind of music policy advice that came his way. But also, it's just about timing. That if you look at the history since the Second World War, Liberal coalition governments will support the high arts in general, and Labor governments in general, historically since the Second World War, will boost popular culture and around notions of access and participation, and they're more likely to see popular culture as helpful or of some use, and that's particularly been the case since the 80s. So when Creative Australia came out, it held on to those usual Labor traditions, that they didn't see popular culture as necessarily bad, and they're prepared to throw some funding to new popular music initiatives, and particularly around Labor quite likes the idea of popular culture in terms of boosting exports. So whether that's film or music or television, Labor's more likely to assist in those areas. And for the first time, Labor done something no other government had done. It threw money at the gaming industry. So we've got a burgeoning industry in Australia around animation, around computer games, and Labor government was the first government to throw money at that industry and say, we see this as a winner long term in terms of cultural exports. And as soon as the Libs got back in, after Gillard and Rudd, they withdrew that money for the gaming industry, and a lot of the money for popular music was also withdrawn then as well.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter who you vote for, I think you can make statistics are pretty clear in seeing the general trends in terms of who's funded, what's funded, and to what extent it's funded.
Okay. Any other questions before we take a break?
On that depressing note, do you want to take a break?
Okay, we'll just take a break for about 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay.